I guess everybody is here. It's good to be here. We want to obviously welcome you here today and welcome Dr. McClelland, who is going to provide you with lots of intriguing information, as well as historical information about what happened in Dallas when Kennedy was assassinated. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. McClelland, and he will give you the information. Thank you.
I sometimes feel like a broken record talking about this, and there seems to be, maybe with the upcoming 50th anniversary, an increasing interest in the whole history of the assassination. So, pardon me for sounding like a broken record maybe here, but I hope I can at least cover the high points, but not really all of the things that have come before about this in the last nearly 50 years now. To put my own personal view of it in context, in 1962, I had just finished my surgical training program at Parkland Hospital in Dallas. I had joined the general surgical faculty, and I've been on the general surgical faculty there at Southwestern Medical School since that time.
There may be a few more students walking in now before I just start.
Okay. Since that time, and I had 2 days before the assassination just had my 34th birthday. So that's kind of where I was and how I happened to be at Parkland on November 22nd, 1963. On that day, I was in the Parkland operating room, one of the conference rooms, showing a movie of how to repair a hiatus hernia to several of the surgery residents there at Parkland. And I heard a little tap on the conference room door where we were showing that movie. I went to the door and looked out, and standing outside the door was Dr. Chuck Crenshaw, who was one of our senior surgery residents. He asked me to step outside, and he needed to tell me something. So I stopped the projector and stepped outside, and he said, they told us to look for all of you on the surgical faculty because they just got a call in from the police department to the emergency room saying that President Kennedy has been shot during his motorcade downtown, and they're bringing him to the emergency room right now at Parkland. And so they want all the surgical faculty to come down there. So at that time, Southwestern Medical School in Parkland and that whole institution out there was much smaller than it is now. And the surgical faculty consisted of 4 people. Now it consists of over 50 people. But on that day, November the 22nd, as Dr. Crenshaw and I got on the elevator there in the operating room to go down to the emergency room, 2 floors below the operating room where we had been, we were talking to one another in the elevator as we rode down, trying to reassure one another that maybe this was not what they said it was, because very often we would get reports of various terrible things being brought into the emergency room, and when the actual fact was seen, it was found to be not as bad as it was originally reported to be. Well, with that, the elevator door opened up. Dr. Crenshaw and I walked out into a large area called a pit, which was a big area about the size of this half of the room we're in now, there at Parkland, lined by patient cubicles on all sides. There was a hallway, though, coming off of the back of that pit area where our emergency operating rooms were for people who were brought in with really serious automobile accidents or gunshot wounds and whatnot, where we could do immediate surgery. This was called trauma room 1, 2, 3, and 4. Trauma room 1 and 2 were right across from one another in that hallway, and 3 and 4 were right adjacent to those rooms across from one another. So that's what I walked out into, and there was this huge crowd of men in business suits standing there filling shoulder to shoulder this pit area in the emergency room. I thought to myself, I've never seen anything like that. And with that, the crowd spontaneously parted so I could see down to the trauma room 1. And sitting on a folding chair outside the door of trauma room 1 was Mrs. Kennedy in her bloody clothing. I thought in horror to myself, my God, this is really what they said it was. And at the same time, the thought occurred to me that my chief of surgery, Dr. Shires, I knew was out of town at a meeting in Galveston. My 2 associates, Dr. Perry and Dr. Baxter, who was the same age as I was, I thought were probably there around noontime, somewhere up and down Stemmons at a hamburger place, trying to avoid Parkland's food, which was at that time a justifiable thing to do. That meant that I might be the only faculty person in surgery there, which was terrifying. And so I had to force myself almost to continue walking toward trauma room 1 and where Mrs. Kennedy was sitting. And I walked by her, pushed the door open to trauma room 1, and when I opened the door, I immediately was confronted with this terrible view of President Kennedy lying on his back on this cart, and with the light shining in his face. His head was completely covered in blood. And I was also, at the same time I saw that, I was gratified to see that Dr. Baxter and Dr. Perry, my 2 associates, had just preceded me into the room. Dr. Perry was placing a surgical drape over a little wound about the size of the tip of my little finger that was just about here, just above the knot in the president's tie on the right side, just next to the president's trachea or windpipe. So they were exploring that blood vessel in that area, that is the carotid artery and internal jugular vein, because they were concerned immediately that there might be an injury to that vessel that would affect the blood flow of blood to the brain. They hadn't had time to really look at him. This was done just almost as a reaction when they came into trauma room 1. As I walked in and walked by the cart the president was lying on, Dr. Perry leaned across and handed me a little metal surgical retractor and said, Bob, would you stand at the head of the cart here and hold this retractor in this incision we're making in the president's neck to explore this wound. So I did. I walked by Dr. Jenkins, who was our anesthesiology professor, who had also come in at that time and was breathing for the president with an anesthesia machine. They had attached him also to an electrocardiographic monitor, which showed good cardiac activity. So as I walked around to the head of the cart and took the retractor and placed it in the incision that was being made in the president's neck, I immediately was confronted by this massive wound in the back of the president's head, where I'm placing my hand, far back in the head, probably the size at least of a baseball in diameter. And I could actually look down inside the president's skull cavity because the back half of his right cerebral hemisphere had been blown out. And as I stood there, probably about a minute after I assumed that position holding that retractor, the right half of his cerebellum fell out through that hole onto the gurney, onto the cart that he was lying in. Now, the reason I'm describing that in detail is because one of the contentious things about all of the questions about conspiracy and 1 or 2 shooters or how the shots were exactly fired relates to where this wound is. Was it farther forward, as the more official version showed, or whether it was way back in the back, like I saw myself. So that's why I'm describing that in some detail. So this was where we were in trauma room 1, and after about 8 minutes, just as they were completing the exploration of that neck wound and found that there wasn't any injury of the carotid artery, and placed a tracheostomy tube into the trachea, Dr. Kemp Clark, who was our professor of neurosurgery, who'd come into trauma room 1, was standing by the electrocardiographic monitor, which had been showing good cardiac activity. But after about 8 minutes, all of a sudden, the electrocardiographic monitor flatlined and all cardiac activity ceased. Dr. Clark then said to Dr. Perry, he said, "Mac, you can stop now because he's gone." And with that, everybody, a lot of people had surged into the room during this proceeding. Everybody crowded out of the room, and Dr. Baxter and I were wanting to get out ourselves, but as the crowd moved out of trauma room 1, they pushed the cart the president was lying on in such a way that we were trapped, Dr. Baxter and I, against the cart and the wall of trauma room 1. So there we stood as the rest of the crowd left the room. And when they got out, we began to push the cart away so that we could step around the end of it and leave ourselves. But before we could do that, the door came open, and Father Huber, a priest who had been called to administer last rites to the president, came walking into trauma room 1. We would have had to push him out of the way in order for Dr. Baxter and I to leave. So again, we just froze against the wall while Father Huber came in, pulled the sheet off the president's head and anointed him, and then began to administer last rites. I couldn't hear but the first phrase of what he said. He leaned over to the president's left ear and said, "If thou livest." And then he continued talking in a much lower voice, and I couldn't hear the rest of it. But he completed the last rites and began to get ready to leave himself. But before he could, the door came open again, and Mrs. Kennedy came in. She stood by the president's head as he lay there on the gurney, and stood there for a moment, and I couldn't hear what she said, but she clearly, from the context of his answer, had asked Father Huber if the president had received last rites. And he said to her, "Yes, I've given him conditional absolution," with some emphasis on the conditional. Mrs. Kennedy, on hearing that, grimaced. She didn't like to hear that word conditional, but she didn't say anything. She stood there for a few moments and then exchanged the ring from her finger onto the president's finger and a ring from his finger onto her finger. She stood there another few moments, walked to the end of the cart the president was lying on, and his right foot, his bare right foot, was sticking out from underneath the sheet. Mrs. Kennedy stood for a few moments beside his foot, then leaned over, kissed his foot, turned and walked out of the room. And that was the last we saw of her. And after that, Dr. Baxter and I moved out of trauma room 1, now that we had a clear way out. So that's what happened that I saw myself in trauma room 1 on that day. What I'm going to describe to you now was described to us an hour or two after that by Dr. Rose, who was our forensic pathologist at Parkland Hospital at that time, i.e. the pathologist who performed a coroner's type assessment of the body after any kind of murder or crime of that type. Well, Dr. Rose's office was on a corridor that led out of Parkland Hospital onto the dock. And he had a little window that looked out into that corridor. And as he looked out his window, he saw the procession of people with this cart bearing the president's body passing by the window in his office. They had ordered a large bronze coffin from O'Neill Funeral Home that had been brought out to Parkland immediately. And they placed the president's body in that coffin, left it on the gurney on which he had been treated, and then moved it out of trauma room 1 and to this corridor that was probably about 30 or 40 feet away from where they had been at trauma room 1 and were proceeding down that corridor to an ambulance to go back to Air Force One and fly the president back to Washington. However, when Dr. Rose saw them doing that, moving out toward the exit, he stepped out of his office and stood in front of the group that was moving out toward the exit. The group was headed up by 2 Secret Service men, one of whom was bearing a Thompson submachine gun. Dr. Rose said the one that was unencumbered by the machine gun didn't say anything when he stopped him, but walked over to Dr. Rose, put his hands underneath his armpits, lifted him up off the ground, and set him over against the wall of the corridor, and shook his finger in his face as if to say, "Get out of the way, we're leaving," which they did. And Dr. Rose didn't persist anymore beyond that. And they took the president's body to the ambulance, to Air Force One, and flew it back to Washington, where a post-mortem exam was carried out at the Naval Hospital that evening when they got back to Washington. Now, there's been a lot of commentary about why they were so persistent in seeing that the post-mortem exam not be performed here in Dallas, but be performed at the Naval Hospital where they had no control over it in Washington. That's a very long story in itself. Well, that's what happened on the 22nd of November to President Kennedy. Saturday came and went, nothing else happened. On Sunday, I was at home around noon. My wife and I had just returned from church with my 2 small children, and we were going out to lunch. While they were upstairs getting ready, I thought, well, I'll turn the television on and see what's happening. As I turned the television on, the sound came on, and I could hear them saying, "He's been shot, he's been shot." And then the picture formed, and I could see what many people have seen, I'm sure, here. Ruby has just been, the assassin has just shot Oswald as he's being transferred from the police jail downtown to the county jail. And as he's being transferred, he is handcuffed to a deputy sheriff, Mr. Level, who also is still with us. He's 90 years old now, lives here in Dallas. And so they put Oswald into an ambulance and came out to Tarpon with him. And I, having seen that, I walked to the foot of my stairway, called up to my wife, and I said, "I'm going to have to miss lunch and go to Tarpon because they've just shot Oswald, and so I need to go and see what I can do to help." She called down and said, "Who is Oswald?" And I said, "He's the man they say shot President Kennedy." "Oh," she said, "well, we'll see you later." So with that, I got in my car, sped out toward Parkland, and as I was driving down Beverly, I looked up and saw Dr. Shire's car coming toward me. He was my chief of surgery, who had not been at the hospital on the 22nd, but had now returned from a meeting in Galveston where he had been at that time. And we stopped our cars beside each other there on the street and communicated that we had just heard what had happened to Oswald. He turned his car around, we sped out to Parkland, pulled up behind the emergency room, went into the emergency room to trauma room 2, where Oswald had been taken. We looked in there, saw that that was a beehive of activity with a lot of the resident surgeons, the interns, the nurses, orderlies, everybody doing everything they could to get Oswald set up for exploration of his injury. What happened when Oswald was shot, he turned so that instead of the bullet going straight through from front to back, where it might not have caused a fatal injury, in turning, the bullet, instead of going straight through from front to back, went in the left side and across the back part of his abdominal cavity. And in doing that, it injured both his aorta and his vena cava, the 2 major blood vessels, of course, abdominal cavity. Usually that injury itself is immediately fatal at the site of its occurrence. But as luck would have it, the blood clot formed around those vessels so that the bleeding was slowed way down, and he was able to make it to Parkland, to be resuscitated, and to be explored. He was explored. Dr. Shires was the operating surgeon, Dr. Perry, who was in the operating room at that time, and I, and Dr. Ron Jones, who's now the chief of surgery at Baylor Hospital here in Dallas. The four of us explored Oswald's injuries through a long midline abdominal incision. And Dr. Shires succeeded in getting down near the site of the injuries and was about to place large aortic clamps onto those vessels when Oswald arrested. With that, Dr. Perry and I dropped out of surgery. Dr. Perry opened Oswald's left chest, and we massaged his heart. And initially it looked like that the contractility would begin again, but then it promptly stopped again. And on at least 3 or 4 occasions, we got it started and then it would stop again. But finally it was apparent that it was not going to recover, so he was pronounced dead. As soon as that happened, we went out to the nurse's station there in the operating room, and the deputy sheriff, Mr. Lovell, who'd been handcuffed to him, was sitting out there waiting to see what happened. He was talking to us about the circumstances of the shooting, and he said as soon as he was shot, he told us, he got down over Oswald's body on all fours, put his face in Oswald's face and said, "Son, you're hurt real bad. Do you want to say anything to me now?" He said with that, Oswald opened his eyes real wide, looked up at him for a few long moments like he was thinking about whether he wanted to say anything or not, and then shook his head vigorously from side to side as if no, he did not want to say anything, closed his eyes, and that was the last time, of course, he closed them. Mr. Lovell said, "I'll believe until the day I die," that he was about to say something of critical importance to me, but then decided better of it, so we'll never know what he took to his grave with him and whatever his part was in the shooting. Now, since that time, of course, everybody has argued back and forth as to whether there was one shooter or 2 shooters, whether Oswald was the one shooter or not. And indeed, of course, that's what the Warren Commission that was promptly set up after this occurred concluded, that Oswald was just, as they say, quote unquote, a lone nut who got up one morning and decided that he would shoot the president. And that was the official version. However, fewer than 20%, even at that time, and even less later, believed the conclusions of the Warren Commission. Enough so that in 1976, the House Special Select Committee on Assassinations was set up by Congress to again open the investigation. And they carried out a rather thorough investigation that went on, off and on, from 1976 to 1979. The conclusion that they finally came to, after first stating that they could not release all of their findings until the year 2029, 50 years after they had completed this investigation. But what they did say, that they did not agree with the Warren Commission, that they concluded that there was more than one shooter, i.e. that there was a conspiracy of some type. However, they were not at liberty to say what that might be, the nature of that conspiracy. Well, a huge amount of speculation and data and information has come out over the nearly 50 years since that time. More than 2,500 books have been written about that. In fact, I've got 5 recent books up here that some of you, after we finish talking about this, might want to look at. And so there's just been a great deal of information that's poured out about this. My own personal confrontation with the concept that there was another shooter didn't come until 1975, 12 years after the assassination, when one evening I came home from Parkland my wife was watching Geraldo Rivera's show, and she said, I'll come in here quick because Geraldo Rivera has acquired for the first time a copy of the Zapruder movie film of the actual assassination and shooting of the president. And he's going to show that on television. So I went in quickly and sat down and watched that. I think it's a 29-second segment of film that shows the president actually being shot. And what happens on that film, which probably many of you may have seen in some venue before, you see his motorcade coming off of Houston Street and turning onto Elm Street, going very slowly. And just as he begins to proceed down Elm Street toward the triple underpass, you can see the president places both of his hands up toward his neck, where that wound was that Dr. Malcolm Perry, Dr. Baxter, and I did the exploration on November 22nd. Anyway, you see his hands go up to his neck. Then the motorcade proceeds on down Elm Street and disappears behind a sign there at the edge of Elm Street for a few seconds. Then it comes out from behind that sign, and when it does, you see Mrs. Kennedy leaning over toward President Kennedy, who still has his hands up to his neck, as if to ask him what's wrong. And just as she does that, all of a sudden, the president's head literally explodes in a geyser of blood and cerebral tissue. And he falls back to the left and to the backwards and to the left, as if you might expect him to fall if he had been shot from the grassy knoll or the picket fence, which is exactly where a great deal of information indicates that the second shot that actually was the shot that killed him came from. Whether the first shot came from the 6th floor of the school book depository or not, that's probably the case that it did. But that's not the shot that killed him. The shot that killed him came from the picket fence. And there's a great deal of information that's accumulated, various witnesses who corroborate the fact that there was a shooter on the grassy knoll. We don't have time to go into talking about each one of those witnesses that corroborates that observation of the second shot from behind the picket fence. But that's what happened with that shot there, and with Oswald and with the president on those two critical days. And I'm gonna, I think, probably be out of time about now. Maybe some questions?
Sure, you've got extra time this hour. You've got a little bit more time than we had last time.
Okay, so any questions that might bring up anybody's
Dr.
mind?
McClelland, did you want to tell them about the shirt? I don't know if you mentioned that.
When I went in to take part in the treatment of President Kennedy, I had on just my regular suit. And so didn't have any opportunity, of course, to change. And when we got through, my suit was completely soaked in blood. The next day, my wife took my suit to the cleaners. The cleaner knew what this was, of course, and he said, "Are you going to have this cleaned?" And she said, "Well, my husband only has 2 suits," and so she got it cleaned. However, I did keep the shirt that I had on that day. Oh, I got it out there. And this is that, if any of you want to inspect that more closely, that's President Kennedy's blood on the tail of my shirt. So I did keep that part of my experience here. So, anyway, anything else that I'm not bringing up that maybe you...
Did you want to take some questions?
Yeah.
Does anybody have any questions that you'd like to ask?
When you first came in, not just as being the president, but did you feel like a great sense of desperation and just sitting to say?
Well, in something like that, I mean, I don't know how anybody would feel but my own self. It's such a shock. It's, like I said, as we were riding down the elevator, Dr. Crenshaw and I were telling each other, "Oh, this is probably nothing." even when I walked into the room, you're so numb and non-thinking, you're not having any thoughts about anything. You're reacting, you're not thinking, you're reacting. Only later do you kind of think, you know, my goodness, what is all this and what does it signify? Yes, sir.
Why do you think Jack Ruby killed Lee Harvey Oswald?
Why did Ruby shoot Oswald?
Why do you think, like personally?
What?
Why do you think he shot them?
Okay, well, that's another several books full of information. What I think is probably generally thought, although what Ruby said himself, was that he did it out of sympathy for Mrs. Kennedy, to get rid of Oswald so that he wouldn't go through the court system and then remind her all the time that it was out of sympathy for her. Well, a great deal of information now indicates that Ruby was actually a part of the mafia. And the actual people who brought this assassination about, who did the deed, if you will, was probably agents, assassins who were hired by Carlos Marcello, who was the head of the mafia in New Orleans at that time. And Ruby was a sort of an associate of those people. And he was charged, a lot of people feel, and there's a reasonable amount of indication of that, he was charged with shooting Oswald and getting him out of the way so that the information that Oswald might provide to the investigators would not be available. That's why he was charged with shooting. In fact, there's kind of an interesting story about that from one of the jailers of Ruby. He said that when he was put into the jail cell immediately after he was shot, he was obviously extremely distraught, trembling and shaking and pale and sweating, and as if he, you know, as you might expect he would be. But he continued being like that, and then a little bit after that, just a few minutes after they got to the jail cell, one of the jailers said, "Well, Jack, it looks like it's going to be the chair for you because Oswald just died at Parkland." And he said with that, it's as if a great relief passed over Ruby. He quit shaking, he settled down, he was completely calm after that. He was gratified to hear that Oswald had died, that he had succeeded in getting him shot. And so he visibly responded to that. Does that partially answer your question?
Yes.
Dr. McClelland, would you talk about Mr. Hoffman?
Mr. Hoffman, no, I didn't. One of the, probably I would say the best witness to the shooter behind the picket fence, whom I came to know personally myself, was Mr. Ed Hoffman. Mr. Hoffman actually saw the weapon, the rifle fired that shot the president in the head, and they killed him from behind the picket fence. And what happened there that enabled Mr. Hoffman to see that, he was working for Texas Instruments on that day and injured a tooth, chipped a tooth or something at lunch, and asked to be excused to go see his dentist in Arlington. And they told him that he could go do that. And he got in his car, drove out toward Arlington, and was beginning to drive along Stemmons, when he, along with all the other traffic on Stemmons, was pulled off by the police to the side because the president's motorcade had been planned to go down Stemmons to the market center where he was scheduled to deliver a speech at noon. Well, this put Mr. Hoffman in a position directly behind the picket fence at the edge of Stemmons, probably 500 or 600 feet behind there. At that time, there was no undergrowth or trees or anything. It was an unobstructed view. Nowadays, that view is not available. There's a lot of undergrowth and trees and other things that would obstruct that view. But as Mr. Hoffman got out of his car and looked over there toward the back of the picket fence on the grassy knoll at Dealey Plaza, he saw two men. One man was in a business suit standing right behind the fence. The other man was a man in workman's coveralls who was carrying a tool bag. He, as he stood there and watched that, Mr. Hoffman said he saw the man in the business suit lift a rifle up that he had been holding in front of him with its butt on the ground, put the rifle on top of the picket fence and fire the weapon at the president, and saw it hit him in the head. So he had a direct view of that, as also did a man, a railroad switchman, who was in a switch tower behind the picket fence there at Dealey Plaza. He's now dead. Mr. Hoffman is also now dead. However, about 2 years ago, at a group of people who were meeting here who have an interest in the assassination, I was invited to come down to that meeting at the Adolphus Hotel. And as I got down there, two men came up to me and asked me to sit at their table with them where this meeting was being held, where they were having a meal during that meeting. So I went in and sat down with them at the table. And these two men were two high school history teachers from small towns in Kansas. They had written a book after studying Mr. Hoffman's story about having seen this, and was published book, I believe the title, as I recall, is From Behind the Fence Line. And what they told me when I sat down there at the table, I interviewed and talked to Mr. Hoffman via his daughter. I had to do that because Mr. Hoffman is a deaf mute. And for that reason, nobody had believed his story. When he saw what he saw on that day, he went over to the police station directly there at Dealey Plaza and went in there where there were several deputies and 2 or 3 FBI men, and tried to tell them, despite his lack of being able to communicate adequately, what he had seen. Well, at that time, unfortunately, the way deaf mutes were referred to, they were said to be deaf and dumb, with emphasis on the dumb, which was the cool way that they were looked at that time. And he was just simply dismissed. And on several other occasions, he was dismissed. That Thanksgiving, particularly notable, is that he was at a Thanksgiving dinner out at Garland with his family. They told me about that evening. And the family was gathered there, and his uncle, who was a police lieutenant on the Dallas police force, Mr. Hoffman asked his father if he would get his uncle to listen to what he had to say about what he had seen. Well, when Mr. Hoffman's uncle, the police lieutenant, heard that, he went over to Mr. Hoffman, he said, got down in his face and said to him, of course Mr. Hoffman could read lips, "Ed, you keep your mouth shut or you're going to be killed." And so that was how that was dismissed by his family on that Thanksgiving day right after the assassination. But there's a great deal of evidence that has accumulated since then about the fact that there is a conspiracy, that the actual assassins were the mafia under the aegis of Mr. Carlos Marcello, and that who were the people that brought that conspiracy about. There's at least a fair segment of belief that it came about from the government itself, perhaps from the Defense Department, from the CIA, because what President Kennedy had done on at least 3 occasions during the Bay of Pigs, during the Berlin Wall crisis in August of '61, and then during the missile crisis of '62, there was a significant push in the Defense Department for a first nuclear strike against Russia. And President Kennedy, on all of those occasions, headed it off and prevented them by executive action from carrying that out. Now that's just some theorizing about that. It's addressed in several of the books that I've got up here and other books beside. So that may have been the origin of that assassination, even though it was carried out by assassins from the mafia. It's a little bit of similarity to Abraham Lincoln's assassination. It's here 150 years afterwards. We don't know the full story on that, but we do know that there was a conspiracy. In fact, 4 people were convicted and hanged shortly after President Lincoln was shot. But nobody knows to this day who is the person within the government who probably set that assassination of the president up. The actual shooter, of course, being John Wilkes Booth. But there's some evidence that's been dismissed by most people that the Secretary of War, who was a radical Republican and wanted to bring about a draconic Reconstruction policy in contrast to President Lincoln, who wanted a much gentler Reconstruction policy, they thought they probably needed to get Lincoln out of the way in order to carry out the Reconstruction policies that the radical Republicans wanted to do. So that there again, there may have been an origin of that assassination from the highest levels of government. It's highly theoretical, but there are several books about it. Yes, sir.
If Kennedy was shot in the back of the head, then how could the shooter have been on the grassy knoll which was in front of him?
Well, the thing is that he was shot in the back, but that shot went in his back. The shot from the front that killed him came in on the picket fence and blew out the back of his head. This was an exit wound back here, not an entrance wound, as the Warren Commission indicated in its official report that this was an entrance wound higher on the top of the skull. In actual fact, the wound probably, and we say probably because we didn't see it and nobody reported it, came in through this shock of hair that was down over his forehead and was covered in blood. It entered here, somewhere around the hairline, and traveled tangentially across his skull and blew out the back of his head.
Didn't
That's where that came from.
Dr. McClelland, didn't Dr. Perry suggest that there was an entry wound on the left side of his head? And
Oh, that was
the
me.
exit? Was that you as well?
Yeah, because Dr. Jenkins, when I walked in, said that, he said, Bob, there's a wound here.
Okay.
He later took that back. And so what I thought when I first stood at the early and looked down at that wound, I said, well, this was here as an entry wound. And I think the entry wound, although again I emphasize nobody saw it because it would have been hidden under all this bloody hair on the president's head. That the entry wound was farther around from the front. And the wound came in at the hairline, blew out the back. That's so much like it there.
If the Secret Service would not have whisked his body away and the state mandated autopsy, that would have been discovered.
I don't know. How much they, altered the wound, if they did or not. I really don't feel that it would. That's just my own personal feeling. I don't think it would matter. Yes, ma'am. Well, there was a shooter there. Whether it was Oswald or not, some people have even questioned that. But it probably was. I think it's pretty clear cut that Oswald was not just some known, nobody. If you look at his history, he'd been in the Marines. He had actually tried to give up his citizenship, went to Russia, married a KGB colonel's daughter. He was probably a hanger-on with the CIA. He had all kinds of loaded history. He was not just some simple, nobody. So I think he very definitely was probably the sixth floor. He fired that first shot that caused him to raise his hands to his neck. And the thing that's unbelievable about that is the so-called magic bullet theory that Senator Allen Specter came up with. That is, he says, and this is in the official Warren Commission report, that the bullet from the sixth floor that came in his back, this was an exit wound in his neck, not an entrance wound that we were exploring. And that bullet that came out of his neck also injured Governor Connolly and blew out a big hole in Governor Connolly's chest on the right side, also injuring his left wrist and going into the leg on the right, through the femoral artery vein. That's the magic bullet theory, which everybody, I think, has agreed is an absurdity. That there's no way that bullet coming this way could have then swerved around and gone through Governor Collins' chest. There was another gunman who did that. That has never been thoroughly worked out. But there was certainly, that indicated that there was not a single shooting.
While people were treating President Kennedy, where was the governor at?
Okay, good question. Governor Connolly was right across the hall in trauma room 2, being treated by Dr. Shaw, who was our professor of thoracic surgery, and by Dr. James Red Duke, who was one of our surgery residents. And they saved the governor's life by putting an occlusive dressing over this great big hole that he had in the side of his chest. Otherwise, he would have died. And then later that afternoon, about 3 or 4 o'clock, Dr. Baxter and I and Dr. Shires, who had been, interestingly enough, flown back from Galveston in a Sabre jet from Barksdale Air Force Field in Houston. The 3 of us explored Governor Collins' femoral vessels, where that bullet that had hit him and all that. But that magic bullet theory that one bullet caused the governor's injuries and also injured the president, that's